Hello friends, hope you're all doing good. Today the topic which I have for you is a very interesting and a very clinically oriented topic which you will find very useful in the clinical settings and in general day-to-day use when managing different kinds of trauma patients. So the topic for today is the Glasgow Coma Scale, GCS. So we're going to discuss this topic with the help of mnemonics, and we're going to cover different aspects of the Glasgow Coma Scale, which includes the I score, the verbal score, and the motor score. And before moving on with the topic, we need to know that the highest possible score that one can get is 15 by 15, and the lowest possible score, the Glasgow Coma score, which one can get in possible clinical settings, is not 0, it's not 1, it's not 2, it's 3 by 15. So how do we get these scores and how do we use these for the management of patients in trauma settings? We're going to discuss it later on in the video. So before proceeding on with the video, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure to hit the bell icon and hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss the upcoming future videos. The score which we have for the eye movements is 4. Over here you can see in the top right corner the total eye score is 4 by 4, and the lowest score which you can get for the eye is 1 by 4. So how do we get that score, and how do we use this mnemonic of super VPN to create a handy and an efficient memory for the eye score? So moving on, the first score, if we will get a 4 by 4 or a full score for the eye, how is that possible? That a patient comes to you in trauma settings, alright, and is in a good shape, alright, he has suffered some minor bruises or lacerations, but the patient is having spontaneous eye movements and is opening and closing his eyes at his own will, and you're not instructing him to open his eyes or close his eyes or giving him any kind of painful stimulus. So the patient is closing and opening his eyes at his own will and is having spontaneous eye movements. So that's going to give the patient a score of 4 by 4. Alright, so moving on with the next score, and the patient is having a relatively more critical injury than the first score. So we're going to move one score down. Alright, so when the patient is going to have a 3 by 4 score, a patient is going to have a 3 by 4 score when the patient is opening his eyes to vocal commands, alright, not at his own will, but to vocal commands when the doctor commands him to open his eyes or asks him giving him commands to open his eyes, and then he opens his eyes. So that's going to give him a score of 3 by 4. So what's going to give the patient a score of 2 by 4? A 2 by 4 score means that the patient has eye opening to painful stimulus. Alright, the patient does not open his eyes at his own will. The patient is not opening his eyes to vocal commands of the doctor or the practitioner. The patient is opening his eyes only to a painful stimulus given anywhere on the body. Alright, so that's going to give a patient a score of 2 by 4. And the last score for the eye is 1. 1 by 4 score is given in the eye sector when the patient does not open his eyes at his own will, the patient does not open his eyes to the vocal commands of the doctor, and the patient does not open his eyes to painful stimulus. Alright, so how does the mnemonic of super VPN fit into all of this? Alright, super VPN, S for super, and then to vocal commands V, and then P for painful stimulus, and N for no eye movements. Alright. Second part in the calculation of the Glasgow Coma score is the calculation of the verbal score. We had seen in the eye movements that the total score for the eye movements was 4 by 4, and the lowest possible score which one could get in the eye movements was 1 by 4. For this, we have a total score of 5 by 5, and the lowest possible score that one can get for this is 1 by 5. You might be noticing that the lowest possible scores in all of these settings is not 0. All right, the minimum possible score that one can get in any of these three, i.e. verbal and motor ones, are 1. All right, so that is why in the beginning of this video I had told you that in the three sectors, if the patient does not respond via eye movements, or does not speak anything, does not say anything at all, he is given a score of 1 for verbal, 1 for eye, and if the patient does not move his hands, or does not move his body parts, he's given a score of 1 for motor movements as well. So that gives a total minimum score of 3 by 15. All right. So moving on with the verbal score, the mnemonic for this one is nobody calls the boy in school at noon. So how do we fit this mnemonic for this score? You might be noticing that the capital letters at the start of each of these words indicates a start of a different score. All right, so nobody, N corresponds to the fifth one, calls, C corresponds to the fourth one, B corresponds to the third one, S corresponds to the second one, and N corresponds to the 1. All right, the last one. So nobody calls the boy in school at noon. So moving on with a score of 5 by 5. A 5 by 5 score indicates a normal speech. A doctor comes to the patient, asks him his name, and the patient responds normally. So that score is given a score of 5 by 5. So a patient, if he is a relatively more traumatic one, so he might be a bit confused. All right, if the doctor comes towards the patient and asks him his name, he might be confused before answering the question. All right, if the doctor asks him his name, or if he is well oriented in time, space, and person, he might be confused and might answer wrong to the question asked by the doctor, or he might take some time before answering the question. So that gives a score of 4 by 5 of confused speech. So what does a score of 3 by 5 for verbal mean? A score of 3 by 5 for verbal means broken words or sentences. Now, if a patient is, in a trauma setting, he is not confused, but is speaking broken words or sentences. All right, if the doctor comes to the patient and asks him his name, or questions him regularly, like what's his name, where is he, what's the time of the day, where is he at the moment. So the patient, he might be confused, but apart from being confused, he is speaking broken words or sentences. Like he might be saying who, why, and why not, at hospital, and any kind of words, irregular words or broken words or sentences which does not make any sense. So that gives a score of 3 by 5. The score of 2 by 5 for verbal stand for. A score of 2 by 5 for verbal stands for incomprehensible sounds or speech. So for this, you need to understand the concept that a person, if he has suffered a deep-seated brain injury or has a head injury which is really exaggerated or is really deep, so the person will be unable to communicate what he wants to. Of course, he might not be confused, he might not be speaking any broken words or sentences, he might just be making sounds at that moment, all right? Because he might be in pain, he might be confused, or if he wants to communicate, he can't, because he has suffered a deep-seated brain injury which disables the speech centers of the brain, and he might be unable to communicate and might just be making sounds at the moment. So a score of 1 by 5 stands for no verbal response to any type of painful stimulus, to any type of commands given by the doctor, and the patient is obtunded and is unable to speak or communicate or say anything. So that gives the lowest score of 1 by 5 in the verbal sector. The last sector of the Glasgow comma score calculation is the motor score. So the total score which we have in this sector is 6 by 6, and the lowest possible score which one can get is 1 by 6. So the mnemonic which we're going to use for this one is no longer the wolf finds to eat at night. The different colored starting letters of these words indicate for the different scores. Alright, so the N for this stands for the 6 score, L in the longer one stands for the 5. Skip this one, which is written whole in black. Now moving on with the wolf, the W of the wolf corresponds to the 4th one, that is withdraws. Alright, the F in the finds corresponds to the 3rd score of the flexion, and skip this one written whole black. And moving on with the eat, the E of the eat corresponds to the extension response, and the starting N of the night corresponds to the no response for the 1/6 score. Alright, so moving on with understanding of how to calculate the score. So no longer the wolf finds to eat at night. Alright, so total score of 6/6 is given to the patient who is spontaneously moving his arms and legs, and when a doctor comes towards the patient in trauma settings and shakes his hands, asks him his name, extends his arms, and the patient in return extends his arms as well and shakes arms with the doctor, so that confirms that the patient has no motor lesion and the patient is able to move his hands normally and move his legs normally. So that is given a score of 6/6. Score down, that is a score of 5/6, and the patient localizes to a painful stimulus. So what does this mean? Alright, the doctor comes towards the patient and he extends his arms, expecting a return response that the patient might extend his arms as well for the shaking of arms, but the patient doesn't. Alright, so the next step which a doctor would normally do is give a painful stimulus to the patient so that the patient can localize where the painful stimulus is being given at. Alright, so this divides the painful category into 2 parts, the score of 5/6 and a score of 4/6. If a doctor comes to the patient and gives a painful stimulus, so 2 things can happen. Alright, over here 2 things can happen. The person right away goes towards the painful stimulus, his hand goes towards the painful stimulus, and speedily throws away the hands of the doctor because he is feeling irritated at that moment when the doctor is giving a painful stimulus. So if a person or a patient exactly localizes where the doctor is pinching him or giving him a painful stimulus, so that gives a score of 5/6. And if the lesion is as such that the doctor gives the painful stimulus to the patient and the person does not know where the painful stimulus is being given at exactly, alright, the patient's arms and hands do not go to the place where the painful stimulus is being given. Alright, he is irritated and he moves his hands and arms away from the painful stimulus, withdraws from the painful stimulus. Alright, so if the patient's hands and arms goes towards the painful stimulus, it's given a score of 5/6. If a patient's arms and hands goes away from the painful stimulus or withdraws from the painful stimulus, that is given a score of 4/6. So moving one step further down the hill, that is a score of 3/6. Now the scores of 3/6 and 2/6 are actually a bit difficult to understand for most clinicians and most junior doctors because they involve a technical understanding of the different motor pathways within the body. Alright, so what does a score of 3/6 and a 2/6 mean? These scores basically they stand for deep-seated brain injury. So a person is given a score of 3/6 when he has a flexion response. What does a flexion response look like? You can see here right in front of the screen here. So that is what a flexion response looks like. And what does a flexion response indicate? A flexion response in simple indicates a deep-seated brain lesion which is above the red nucleus. Now the red nucleus, when the lesion is above the red nucleus is inhibited. So the rubrospinal tract, which originates from the red nucleus towards the spine, so that is facilitated. And the rubrospinal tract is basically responsible for the flexure muscles of the upper limb. So when the rubrospinal tract is facilitated, the flexure muscles of the upper limb go into hyperaction, and the flexure response is what you see in a score of 3/6. And if we move down, the patient's legs are fully extended, the foot are extended. Why? Because the lateral corticospinal tracts, they are disrupted. As the corticospinal tracts, they coordinate to help the flexure muscles of the lower limb to cause flexion. So when they're disrupted, so that causes a hyperextension of the foot. So the opposite of that happens in a score of 2/6. A score of 2/6 also indicates a deep-seated brain lesion, but in contrast to the lesion above the red nucleus, there is a lesion below the red nucleus. All right, above the red nucleus, the lesion might be in the cerebral hemispheres, it might be in the internal nucleus, internal capsule, or it might be in the thalamus. All right, and the lesion which is below the red nucleus, it might be in the midbrain or the cerebellum. Basically, a pontine stroke is usually and commonly presenting with extension response. So what does a score of 2/6 look like, or what does the extension response look like? You can see here right in front of your screen. Here it is. So moving on with the last part of the mnemonic, over here the N of the night, and the last 1/6 response is no response at all. No motor response. A person is obtunded and does not move his arms and legs, foot and hand, anything at all. So the person does not give any type of response in the motor sector. So that gives a score of 1/6. Before moving on to the end of this video, a very important question is that when does a need arise to intubate a patient? Alright, when to put a laryngoscope and when to put the endotracheal tube within the trachea of the patient. So how do we assess that with the Glasgow comma score? We add it all up for the eye score, verbal score, and the motor score, and if we get a score of 8 or less than 8/15, so that indicates an urgent need for intubation of the patient, because at that moment when the score is less than 8, that indicates that the patient is critical and the patient is on the verge of decline. So you need to save the patient and intubate him or her right away. And the person, when he is having a score of 3/15, that basically indicates a brain dead patient who is unable to coordinate, and the patient is unable to give eye movements, verbal movements, or motor movements. So that's all with this video, folks. Hope you enjoyed the video and learned it with the help of mnemonics. And take care and stay blessed, and don't forget to subscribe the channel to keep on receiving all the future study videos. Thanks a lot.